From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
After Congress narrowly avoids a pre-Christmas government closure, is this a preview of the next 2 years? Or what lessons can be learned from the shutdown showdown, including maybe by Donald Trump and Elon Musk? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. On Saturday, President Biden signed a bill to extend government funding into March, technically after the midnight deadline, but without any interruption in government funding, government programs. The bill included $100 billion in disaster aid, $10 billion in assistance to farmers, did not include what President Trump wanted, which is an increase in the debt ceiling. President Biden said this agreement represents a compromise, which means neither side got everything it wanted, but it ensures the government can continue to operate at full capacity. Here's what Speaker of the House Mike Johnson was saying on Friday after the bill passed his chamber.
This is America First legislation because it allows us to be set up to deliver for the American people. In January, we will make a sea change in Washington. President Trump will return to D.C. and to the White House, and we will have Republican control of the Senate and the House. Things are going to be very different around here. This was a necessary step to bridge the gap, to put us into that moment where we can put our fingerprints on the final decisions on spending for 2025.
Kim, maybe the place to start is, what did Congress ultimately pass to avoid this government shutdown, and how much do you think it differed from the original proposal by Speaker Mike Johnson? So in other words, what, if anything, was accomplished by this week-long drama of will they or won't they?
So if you're really concerned by Washington's tendency of getting to the end of a year and wrapping together one big bill and taking all kinds of flotsam and jetsam that they didn't bother to put through regular order through the rest of the year, and they jam it all into this one thing, often with provisions that nobody sees. If you don't like that process, you can argue that what came out in the end was slightly better. And in this regard, so the bill that they were going to pass before Elon Musk and Donald Trump threw a temper tantrum was about 1,500 pages long. By the time they got to the end of it, it was more like 118 pages long. And here's some of the things that came out of the bill. They got rid of a provision that would, for instance, tackle junk fees. That's what they call it, certain charges that they want hotels and ticket salespeople to tell you up front. They got rid of a congressional pay raise. They got rid of changes that were going to affect pharmacy benefit managers. They got rid of a provision in which the federal government reimburses states for food stamp fraud. They got rid of a bit in there that was about criminalizing deep fake images. It goes on and on. There was just all this catch-all stuff they'd thrown in the bill. And so in that regard, if you are a fan of Congress, like having to debate these things in public and be transparent instead of jamming everything in at the end, there was a slight improvement. However, the funny part of this is that this was not necessarily the big complaint of Trump or Musk. Their big complaint and the complaint of some conservatives. Well, conservatives were unhappy with this bill because it contained a boatload of spending, including $100 billion more in disaster aid and $10 billion more for economic aid for farmers, in addition to keeping the government funded at current levels until March 14th. Donald Trump and Elon Musk wanted there to also be a provision in the bill that would suspend the debt ceiling for longer than is currently envisioned. In the end, they didn't get their debt ceiling suspension wish, and all that money for disaster aid and for farmers remained in the bill, which is why 34 Republicans voted against it in the end. So you have to ask yourself if the drama of 4 days of wondering if there was going to be a shutdown and the really ugly look for Republicans who were all throwing stones at each other, and there was a giant food fight for 4 days and showed all the divisions and problems in the party, if it was worth it for that. I think there'd be many Republicans who, in retrospect, would argue it was not.
And that's the difficulty, is there are probably many Republicans in the House and the Senate who would be happy to advance an argument as a caucus, as a conference, as a party that this is what we're going to do. We're going to get rid of this disaster aid funding, or we're going to make the argument that we need to debate these extraneous provisions about pharmacy benefit managers and so forth in the regular order instead of stuffing them into an end of year continuing resolution bill. But it seems to me, Monet, that the challenge they're having is trying to figure out what the putative leader of their party, Donald Trump, wants at any given moment, because they can think that they're all on the same page. They have a plan. They have an agenda. We're going to pass this bill. Then we're going to move into our reconciliation process next year and start getting our priorities together. And then someday at a random time of day, the Trump comes out with a tweet that says, no, this bill is complete trash. You need to kill it. Anybody who doesn't needs to get a primary challenge. Elon Musk jumps on and says, by the way, I'll fund that primary challenge. Then they end up trying to figure out what actually the playbook is. And Monet, I'm starting to wonder whether this is going to be a preview of how the Republicans, with a narrow majority in the House and relatively narrow in the Senate too, the challenge that they're going to have over the next 2 years of the Trump presidency.
I do think that the presence in the background of Donald Trump was a big difference between how this funding fight proceeded compared with some of the previous ones during Mike Johnson's tenure as Speaker. It did seem as if there was a large group of Republicans in the House, particularly members of the Freedom Caucus, who you knew were not going to vote on any piece of funding legislation out of principle because they wanted to make sure that there were offsetting spending cuts for anything that they would put their name on, which meant that Mike Johnson knew from the very beginning that he was going to have to cut a deal with Democrats and would be able to include a bunch of different things that Democrats would demand in return for their support. And in the end, it was going to be ugly. It was going to include a lot of policy priorities that most Republicans, including Johnson himself, might not favor, but that it would pass and they would be able to move on. The fact that Donald Trump now is preparing to return to the White House and wants to be able to set the agenda even now before he's sworn in means that you do see a lot of these House Republicans saying that I don't want to sign on to this bill in cooperation with the Democrats when we're so close to being in full control of the government altogether. And when we know there's a possibility of President Trump condemning the deal that they strike from the background. But I do think that you can't pin all of this on Trump. I do think that there really is no reason why Congress isn't able to deal with some of these provisions like disaster aid, which they knew they were going to have to pass from the get-go, like the Farm Bill and the farm supplemental funding that they ended up deciding to give. These are the types of policy questions that Congress should be able to hash out rather than thinking that these major funding bills are their only vehicle to be able to force consensus and get them through. So a lot of this chaos should have been avoidable if during the past few months they had been deciding to proactively put together something on them and leave the funding fight as a separate question in its own right, rather than trying to put it all into a single pile, which is part of what created a lot of the chaos and dissatisfaction.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. The flip side of President Trump's role here in December 2024, in the waning days of the Biden presidency, is the absence of the current occupant of the Oval Office, President Biden. And Kim, part of what's notable about that is the way that some of the press have now turned on the president. Here's the headline at Politico: Biden is AWOL as Washington spirals into shutdown chaos. The top of the story says that more than a half dozen House Democratic lawmakers said Thursday that they had yet to hear from the president, even as Congress scrambled to salvage a funding deal and avoid shutting down the government. Kim, we're still in the Biden presidency. It's a lame duck period, but President Biden has the signature pen or the veto pen. He still has a majority in the Senate. Remarkable that he seemed last week not to be invested in this funding fight, trying to get through any last priorities that he and the Democrats wanted before they lose power entirely in Washington in a little less than a month.
Yeah, and this is remarkable. That's the only word. Normally, when you have a moment like this, we're talking about shutting down the federal government. This is the head of the federal government. And we heard nothing from him. I mean, if you look back at prior shutdown or cliff moments, the White House was a prime operator, whether it was under a Republican president or a Democratic president. They were in daily conference with the leaders of the Senate and the House. They were out making demands, at least attempting to exert pressure to see things go the direction that they want them to go. And this is pretty much what we're getting from Biden, though, all around. He's been doing some foreign travel, but there's no engagement whatsoever with the nation, at least not publicly. I would note that most of his cabinet heads and agencies are working 24/7 to try to put up some roadblocks to the incoming Trump administration to cement their last priorities, if that's shoveling money out the door, for instance, so that they can deny Republicans the ability to claw it back when they come in. So they're doing things. But the president himself appears to be very checked out. And I find this very concerning, not just from the standard of, or from the position of a congressional fight Congress is now left for the rest of the year. But the rest of the world is watching this as well, too. And the last thing the White House wants is to project the appearance of a president who is not really on the job in these waning days, because that's something our adversaries are watching as well.
One other thing notable I wanted to pull out from last week was the role of Elon Musk. He went on a Twitter tirade against the original spending bill. I guess maybe I'd call it an X.com tirade now. And Monet, notable in that it seems like he did not, to my view, did not understand the options that were available to House Republicans. And that is a frustration, I think, in Washington broadly when you have divided government and a Senate that is still controlled by Chuck Schumer. You have to negotiate. Republicans are not going to get the kind of massive spending cuts that many of them want in this kind of situation. And the alternative is then to shut down the government, which in my view, the party who is trying to shut down the government often gets blamed for by the public and rarely, if ever, gets what they want out of it in the end. And that is what Elon Musk suggested should be done in the middle of last week. He said no bills should be passed Congress on January 20th when Donald Trump takes office. None. Zero, suggesting that we could go about a month of no Social Security checks going out, members of the military not being paid over Christmas, and there would not be a huge political backlash for that. And Monet, I wonder if that is an ill portent, perhaps, for this Department of Government efficiency effort that Musk is leading. He's a great success as a businessman, has built some incredible companies, including SpaceX. But there's a record of successful business people coming into politics and not always understanding the limited options that are available within the political system. And if he thinks that Republicans would have been wise to shut down the government for about a month, I think maybe he is going to start walking into some pretty stiff walls here when he tries to take on these regulatory agencies.
Well, it's an interesting question, because I think that if you asked Elon Musk today, was your intervention in this funding process successful? He would say that it absolutely was, in the sense that he thinks that Congress was on the verge of potentially passing a deal that was loaded with a whole bunch of extras, including some of those provisions that Kim mentioned at the top of this episode. And then he probably was the person most responsible for pushing Trump to intervene. And in the end, they got essentially the same version of the deal in terms of the core spending levels, in terms of the disaster and farm aid, but with some of the extra stripped out. So from his standpoint, he probably thinks, wow, that worked better than I could have possibly thought it would. But I do think that you're right. The way that he went about intervening showed a lot of lack of awareness about how Congress has to function. Frankly, I think a more helpful thing for him to do if he were going to speak up would be to criticize some of the members of the Freedom Caucus who have staked out this territory where they're not going to vote for any clean continuing resolution, and forcing Mike Johnson into the position where he has to rely on Democratic votes just to get the House side of the agreement passed. And so he probably has a lot more to learn in terms of the balance of power between the parties as it currently stands, the way these funding fights proceed. In terms of the effectiveness of DOGE, it's going to be much more in the realm of curtailing executive branch regulations, trying to curb certain types of spending that can be done without having to rely on Congress to get involved. That's what you've seen him and Vivek Ramaswamy lay out in their most persuasive forms of describing what their mandate is going to be. But if they do reach further than that into trying to push Congress to act and trying to have a big imprint on the tax legislation that's coming up, the border legislation that Congress is going to be working on, I do think that their lack of expertise will show, and they could end up losing a lot of goodwill from Republican lawmakers and making things much more difficult for themselves.